Welcome back to 28storms.com. This is now the second video of this Friday, August 19th. The first one had to do with Tropical Storm Harvey making landfall in Central America. Now this video will pertain more toward the tropical wave in the Central Atlantic, and this is the same feature that has a good chance of impacting much of the Caribbean as a classified tropical cyclone, and there are still several models that are indicating that this will be a major hurricane threat to portions of the southeast United States coast. This is the latest graphical tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center. This is Tropical Storm Harvey beginning to move into Central America, but this is the main player that we're going to be keeping a very close watch on over the next 7 to 10 days. This is 97L Invest with a 40% chance of becoming a tropical cyclone within the next 48 hours. And then we also have a tropical wave exiting Africa. This is already very impressive. The Hurricane Center is giving it a 50% chance of formation within the next 2 days, although we're not really that concerned about that one as it's really far out and it has a very good chance of recurving away from any land masses. So if we take a look at today's latest satellite imagery, we can see that our developing tropical wave is showing signs of life. It really didn't have much in the way of any thunderstorm activity over the last 72 hours, but we can easily see that it is on the increase on the latest infrared. And also, if we turn on the latest water vapor imagery, we still see all of that dry air surrounding our tropical disturbance. However, it's beginning to move into more favorable sea surface temperatures, which will allow this to develop more convection and fight off some of that dry air. Now, what makes us confident that this will not at least significantly or rapidly develop before it reaches the Lesser Antilles is this upper level low located well to the east of Bermuda. And while the models correctly forecasted this to move more toward the north, we still have this mid to upper level trough dangling to the southwest, which is going to keep the southwest wind shear somewhat high here across the central Atlantic. So that's going to place a limit on short-term development, but we still cannot rule out a marginal tropical depression or tropical storm as this system begins to move through the Lesser Antilles. Now, if the models are correct, however, we could potentially see more significant development in the medium range as this gets into the central and perhaps the northwest Caribbean. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, this is the latest zoomed in visible image, and we can see that the system is becoming gradually better defined. However, there is no primary center just yet. There are some indications that we could have a mid-level circulation trying to form within some of the strongest convection, although that broad low-level circulation still appears to be fairly broad and perhaps displaced ever so gradually toward the south. So until we get one primary center, that is not going to make the overall forecast very easy. So we need to find one specific center that is going to be the main one, and then we can easily track that thereafter. But in order for the National Hurricane Center to begin running their tropical model suite, they do have to initialize this storm somewhere. So right where these model plots begin, that is their rough guesstimate as to where the primary center is located. And we can see that there is a fair amount of agreement, at least amongst the tropical models, that this will pass just barely to the south of Puerto Rico and then eventually move directly over Hispaniola. And I said this a few days ago, and I'll say it again, Hispaniola is definitely the wild card in terms of this medium and extended range forecast. This landmass can greatly disrupt both the intensity and the track forecast to some extent. But nevertheless, all of the models generally take this in a west-northwest direction across much of the greater Antilles, including Hispaniola and Cuba down the road. We're now going to start looking at some of the 12Z dynamical guidance, starting off with the 12Z GFS. And if I pause this around 48 hours, we see that the model is taking this system across the Lesser Antilles, generally at a fairly weak intensity, really nothing more than a tropical depression. And as we go deeper into time here, we see that the model continues to show a general westerly track just barely to the south of Hispaniola, which is significant because if this goes any more toward the north, then that landmass could greatly disrupt the intensity. But notice what the general idea is. The model is keeping a fairly large and powerful long-wave trough over much of the western Atlantic. Now, down toward the south, that is causing a bit of a gap or a weakness in the Atlantic subtropical ridge near the Bahamas. Now, as of right now, the GFS is not forecasting this trough to be strong enough to fully pull this storm toward the north and east of Florida, but instead it just keeps it on a general west to west-northwest heading instead of due west. And notice what happens here as we get into the day 5 time frame. We have this shortwave trough beginning to appear over Illinois, and that's basically the final and reinforcing shot that this long wave trough has to it. And then as we go into day 6 and day 7, we see that some of this trough begins to split off from the long wave and basically just sits over the southeast states. And eventually what's going to happen is that the hurricane is going to begin moving around the western extent of the Atlantic Ridge, and then by, once again, day 6 into day 7, it's going to fill that trough and eventually get pulled north straight into Florida. From a pattern perspective, the latest 12Z ECMWF run is also very similar to the GFS. This is the current time, and you can't really see anything too much very well here, but this is the developing tropical wave in the central Atlantic. This is the Lesser Antilles. These are the Greater Antilles, and of course this is Florida. So as we advance this into day 1, 2, and 3, we finally begin to see a little bit more steady intensification once it's located just to the south of San Juan, Puerto Rico. But also in terms of the pattern, keep an eye on that long wave trough. It's located between the very powerful ridge over the south central United States that's been fairly persistent across much of the summer. And by 96 hours, or day 4, notice that the trough is beginning to lift out somewhat, and especially by day 5, we see that the Atlantic Ridge is beginning to build back toward the west. But also notice, much like the GFS, we have a bit of a trough split going on, basically meaning that there is somewhat of a weakness left behind here over much of the southeast states. And eventually what's going to happen is that the hurricane will begin to detect that, and then as we go into day 6 and then especially day 7, notice that the storm is moving more northerly, and even more northerly than the GFS is indicating. Now this would be a hurricane threat to the Florida Keys, Miami, and the remainder of southern Florida. And as we go into day 8 and day 9, this European run practically takes the hurricane across the entire Florida peninsula. Now the following is the 12Z CMC model run, and overall it looks like the pattern is very similar to what we saw with the 2 previous models, but notice that once this storm does begin to develop in the southeast Caribbean, it appears to be a bit too far toward the south, so keep that in mind when you see the forecast track. And I'm going to let this animate itself, and then look at this. It develops this into a very powerful hurricane, but just look how far south it is once again, and then eventually it takes it just to the south of Jamaica, and that is by far one of the southernmost Caribbean model runs that I've seen. I don't quite fully believe it, but even despite that, look at the day 6 pattern, okay? So the hurricane is now beginning to approach the Yucatan Channel, so it's beginning to move west-northwest, so around by day 7 you could extrapolate it being somewhere in the southeast Gulf of Mexico in this general location. And look, much like the GFS and European were indicating, we see this trough split ongoing here, and we see this weakness. And if this hurricane is located anywhere in the southeast Gulf of Mexico or southern Florida, it's going to continue riding north, generally into this weakness. And just for good measure, this is the latest 72-hour forecast from the UK Met model. It has our storm developing to the southeast of the Dominican Republic. By day 4, it's located just to the east of Jamaica. And by day 5, look at this, it's actually beginning to show some development here to the south of Cuba. And this is a fairly impressive run for a UK Met model solution. Again, the UK Met is usually one of the more conservative dynamical models, so anytime it even begins to show development, that stands out somewhat. And then in terms of the overall pattern, much like the other models, we still see a bit of a weakness here along the southeast states. And also, just to give you a good idea as to why the models are so bullish on development right now, this is the latest shear forecast from the GFS. This is the current time frame. This is the general location of our tropical system under a somewhat favorable ridge, but we have a lot of southwest winds out ahead of that, and the ridge could be a little bit more intense. So let's go ahead and fast forward this and see what happens. As we see over the first 72 to 96 hours, we see that this ridge really begins to expand in overall coverage, and if it weren't for the land interaction with Hispaniola, the model would obviously be developing this tropical cyclone into a major hurricane a lot quicker. And then this storm is just waiting to get away from the Greater Antilles on this latest forecast run before it really begins to rapidly intensify over the southeast Gulf of Mexico. And as long as this model is correct, by day 7, this is an extremely favorable pattern over the southeast Gulf. And just look at how favorable and intense that upper level ridge is. between the Florida Keys and Cuban coastline. So interests across the eastern Caribbean and especially the greater Antilles are advised to keep a very close watch on this system, and especially as we get closer toward Hispaniola and Cuba, the chances of this impacting those areas as a hurricane really begins to increase. And then finally, once this system gets closer to the United States, it could make a run at becoming a major hurricane, but that all depends on whether this system gets torn up fairly badly by Hispaniola. As of right now, it looks like it's going to pass ever so gradually to the south and begin to intensify in the northwest Caribbean to the south of Cuba before it even reaches the southeast Gulf. And then from that point on, it looks like we will still have a weakness over the eastern Gulf of Mexico or the southeastern states. So it should be more so of a Florida or East Gulf storm. But again, that is roughly a 6 to 7 day forecast. It's still 6 days away from even entering the southeast Gulf of Mexico. So all interests in the Caribbean and Gulf are advised to keep a close watch on this storm. And 28storms.com will be here throughout the week and this weekend, keeping you updated as much as we possibly can. So thanks again for visiting, and have a good evening.